imagine spending your life on the sea, building a boat with your own hands to escape the ghosts of war. Now, picture that boat being destroyed by a wealthy stranger with no regard for what it represents. This is the story of Thomas Reynolds, a quiet veteran whose humble life and old wooden boat were shattered in an instant. But what happens next will leave you speechless. In a town obsessed with wealth and luxury, one forgotten man is about to be honored in a way no one could have predicted. Stay tuned to discover the incredible legacy of Liberty Child and the hero who sailed its waters. Can you imagine a life so intertwined with the sea that every dawn feels like a sacred ritual? Thomas Reynolds, 72, had lived that life in Harborside for decades, his weathered hands steering the wooden boat he'd poured his heart into after returning from Vietnam. Oh, how he cherished those quiet mornings on the water, guiding Liberty Child, a vessel that to the untrained eye was just an old sun-bleached relic. Its paint had peeled under 40 years of salt and sun, its hull creaking with every wave, but to Tom it was a masterpiece, sturdy and true, built by a man who knew beauty lies in the soul of things. In a town now overrun with glitzy yachts and tourists, he was a ghost from another era, respected by a few, unnoticed by most. Who could blame them for overlooking a quiet old sailor in a world obsessed with flash and wealth? Thomas had crafted Liberty Child plank by plank, each hammer strike a way to silence the haunting memories of Vietnam. The locals, they knew next to nothing about his Navy days. He wasn't one to boast, but on still nights when he slept aboard his boat, his screams would drift across the harbor, echoes of a war he never spoke of. Can you feel the weight of that silence? That Wednesday morning started like any other, with Thomas slipping out at 5 to check his crab pots and catch the sunrise at his favorite spot near the harbor mouth. The sea was his sanctuary, wasn't it? But then a deep, ominous throb shattered the calm. The La Vita, a 600-ton Italian yacht, roared around the harbor bend like a gleaming titan slicing through the water with arrogant ease. At its helm, Jackson Reed, a 38-year-old tech mogul who'd just snatched up the town's priciest beachfront estate. The local papers had hailed him as a savior for Harborside's struggling economy, but to Thomas he was just a stranger on a collision course. Frantically, Thomas waved his arms, shouting, "Hey, I'm right here." But his voice was swallowed by the yacht's monstrous engine. Up on the La Vita's deck, Reed and his guests clinked champagne glasses, laughing at some private jest, completely blind or indifferent to the small wooden boat in their path. A harbor security boat bobbed nearby, its officer watching with a nervous frown, but doing nothing. Why didn't he act? The impact hit like a thunderclap, a sickening crunch as Liberty Child's stern shattered under the yacht's steel bow. Thomas leaped to the dock just in time, his aging body crashing hard as his beloved boat, his haven, splintered beneath the La Vita's might. The American flag he'd proudly flown for 40 years tore free, plunging into the churning water, its red stripes bleeding into the foam. Can you picture the heartbreak in that moment? When the yacht's engines finally fell silent, Reed's voice cut through the air, dripping with disdain. "It's just an old fishing tub, get over it." Thomas rose slowly, his arthritic knees screaming in protest. A crowd had gathered, joggers, dock workers, tourists with phones raised like vultures circling a tragedy. Not one offered a hand. The harbor security officer shuffled over, muttering, "Mr. Reynolds, I'll need to file a report." But Thomas wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on his flag, torn and drifting away. Limping along the dock, he reached out with a trembling, aching shoulder and plucked it from the water, clutching it to his chest as if it were a fallen friend. Oh, how that image burns the heart. His gaze met the crowd's, not with anger or blame, but with a quiet dignity that made them look away, ashamed. "Nice boat," Reed jeered from his deck. "Time to upgrade, old-timer. Everything's got an expiration date, right?" Thomas didn't reply. With a straight back despite his pain, he turned away, his steps steady even as his hands shook. A laugh echoed behind him, a phone pinged, and the first video hit the internet with a cruel caption. "Old man, old boat. Old news. How could they be so callous? By noon, the harbor was back to its polished routine. The wreckage of Liberty Child had been swept away like a blemish erased. Online, people scrolled past the video, tossing out LOL comments without a second thought. Did anyone notice the unshed tears in his modest cottage bought with his Navy pension long before Harborside became a rich man's playground, sat on a bluff overlooking the harbor. From his window, he'd watched the town morph from a fishing village into a tourist trap, the change as relentless as That evening, he sat at his kitchen table, a wooden chest open before him. Inside were relics of his service, faded photos of young sailors with solemn eyes, yellowed commendation letters, dog tags that had rested against his heart through stormy sea. At the bottom, neatly folded, was a pristine American flag from his retirement. Can you feel the weight of those memories? His grandson Michael, home from college, leaned in the doorway, fuming. You're gonna sue that guy, right, Grandpa? He destroyed your boat. He's got a... Thomas traced the flag's embroidered stars, shaking his head. He didn't hit me, he murmured. Just something nobody cared about. Michael's young heart burned with outrage. But you built that boat. It meant everything to you. Yes, Thomas sighed. Later, alone, he opened his logbook, where for 40 years he'd noted the weather, the sea's mood, the day's catch. Now he wrote, "First day without Liberty Child. No condolences, but the water still calls. Doesn't it always?" He flipped on his small TV, only to see the local news gushing over Reed's yacht, the biggest to ever grace Harborside. Not a word about the morning's disaster. Online, the video had gone viral with comments like, "That old boat was an eyesore," or "Why doesn't he just buy a modern one?" The harbor master called, his tone flat. "Your boat didn't have radar reflectors or proper lights. It's not up to code, so insurance won't cover it." Thomas listened, thanked him, and hung up. Why mention that Liberty Child was grandfathered under old rules or that he'd never failed an inspection? What was the point? The sea had reclaimed his boat, as it always does. But oh, how that loss stung. Standing on his porch that night, gazing at the harbor lights, the absence of Liberty Child felt like a missing limb. It wasn't just wood and canvas gone. It was the mornings watching dolphins dance in his wake, the evenings when the boat's gentle rocking hushed his nightmare. It was the one place the war couldn't reach, where the ocean's rhythm drowned out memories of gunfire and screams. Across the water, La Vida glowed like a floating palace, music and laughter spilling out as the wealthy partied on, oblivious to an old man's grief. Thomas didn't resent their joy. He'd seen too much pain to begrudge happiness. But couldn't they see what was lost? Not just a boat, but a way of life that honored silence, solitude, and respect for the sea. In the moonlight, he draped his retired service flag over the porch railing, letting the ocean breeze kiss it softly. Did it feel like a farewell? At dawn, he reached for his boat keys out of habit, then stopped, the hollow ache in his chest swallowing the... For the first time in 40 years, he had no destination. As the morning star faded, he didn't demand justice or scream for compensation. All he wanted was respect. Don't you think honor is worth more than gold? If you believe that, type on. A thick fog cloaked Harborside the next morning, veiling the harbor entrance in a ghostly haze. Thomas sat on his porch, coffee growing cold, staring at the misty divide between land and sea. Without Liberty Child, his routine felt pointless, a sailor marooned on dry land. Suddenly, 3 long foghorn blasts shook the stillness. Thomas sat up, his Navy instincts tingling. Large vessels were coming. Through the mist, 6 gray giants emerged, Navy ships in perfect formation, slicing the water with silent purpose. No fanfare, no warning, just an eerie quiet. Their American flags at half-mast in a solemn tribute. What was happening? Townsfolk flocked to the waterfront, shop owners closing up, children released from summer programs, their chatter hushed by the moment's gravity. Thomas watched from his bluff, baffled. No exercises were planned, no VIPs expected. Why this show of force in a tourist town? The lead ship, a guided missile destroyer, docked with precision. Rear Admiral James Nelson stood on deck, his dress whites gleaming, holding a folded American flag, blue stars displayed with reverence. Thomas's heart tightened. He knew that fold, had done it himself for fallen comrades. Was this for him? Despite his aching joints, Thomas hobbled to the harbor, the crowd parting instinctively as if sensing his purpose. Admiral Nelson saluted sharply. Chief Petty Officer Reynolds, permission to come ashore and render honors. Thomas's salute snapped back, muscle memory kicking in. Permission granted, Admiral, he said, voice steady despite his shock. Nelson descended with a color guard, sailors on all 6 ships, standing at attention. 43 years ago, Nelson boomed to the crowd. This man saved the USS Constellation from disaster in a South China Sea storm. He sealed a ruptured cooling system, suffering burns over 60% of his body, saving 228 sleeping sailors from toxic gas. The crowd gasped, eyes turning to Thomas, noticing the faint scars on his neck for the first time. Can you imagine such courage? Can you feel the hush that fell over the crowd as they turned to Thomas Reynolds, their eyes tracing the faint scars along his neck, scars they'd never noticed before, the marks of a hero hidden in plain sight for decades. Chief Reynolds never spoke of his actions. Admiral Nelson's voice rang out, steady and proud. He declined the Navy Cross, asking only that we care for the boys who didn't make it home. For 40 years he's lived among you asking for nothing, expecting nothing. Can you imagine such humility? The crowd stirred, whispers rippling like waves, as they realized the quiet old man they'd passed by was a living legend. Nelson's gaze swept the harbor, pausing on the gleaming La Vita, where Jackson Reed and his guests stood, their faces uneasy. Yesterday, the Admiral declared, his voice sharp with reproach, Thomas's vessel, Liberty Child, was destroyed right here in this harbor. No one offered help, no respect was shown. The flag he served under, it was left to sink in the foam. Oh, how that injustice stung. A young sailor stepped forward, his boots clicking on the dock, carrying a polished wooden plaque. With a respectful bow, he presented it to Thomas, who gazed at the brass plate, gleaming with the words, "For the man who kept the seas safe, even after service." Can you picture the weight of that moment, the pride and pain in Thomas's weathered eyes? The United States Navy does not forget its own. Nelson proclaimed, his words echoing across the water. We're here to honor Chief Petty Officer Thomas Reynolds, to declare that his service never ended, even when he hung up his uniform. All around the harbor, sailors snapped to attention, their salutes crisp against the morning sky. The color guard raised their flags, and in that instant, it wasn't just 6 ships docked in harborside, it was the full might of naval tradition. A brotherhood that spanned generations. Don't you feel the goosebump? Someone in the crowd whipped out their phone, live streaming the ceremony, and within minutes, the footage was racing across social media. The cruel hashtag, #BoomerDown, tied to yesterday's video of Liberty Child's destruction, vanished, replaced by veteran salute. Commenters who'd mocked Thomas hours before scrambled to erase their words, posting instead, "I had no idea. Why didn't we know he was a hero? This is what true service looks like." Isn't it incredible how quickly truth can shift a narrative? On the La Vita, Reed shifted uncomfortably, his usual swagger dimmed. His guests, their champagne flutes forgotten, stood in awkward silence as the ceremony unfolded. After the formal honors, Nelson pulled Thomas aside, his tone softer but no less firm. Your grandson Michael reached out to the Navy Alumni Association. Why didn't you call us yourself, Chief? Thomas shrugged, his voice quiet. It wasn't your problem, sir. It was just a boat. Nelson's eyes narrowed, looking out over the harbor. No, Reynolds, it was never just a boat, and you were never just a sailor. Some debts, they can never be repaid. Can you hear the depth of respect in those words? As the ceremony ended, and the crowd began to thin, something extraordinary happened. One by one, townspeople approached Thomas, people who hadn't spoken to him in years. They offered handshakes, heartfelt thanks, and tearful apologies. The harbor master, his voice thick with emotion, handed Thomas fishing permits for life. You'll always have a place here, he promised. The marina owner stepped up, declaring, any vessel you choose, Thomas, gets a free slip forever. Thomas accepted each gesture with the same quiet dignity he'd shown when his boat was crushed. But if you looked closely, oh, how his eyes sparkled. Not with triumph, but with something deeper, recognition. After decades of fading into the background, he was finally seen. Doesn't that just warm your heart? A week later, a small crowd gathered at Thomas's usual mooring spot for a dedication ceremony. A simple stone marker now stood on the dock, etched with the words Liberty Child, a boat that carried more than one life. The town council had approved it without a single dissent, some members wiping away tears as they admitted they'd never known the true story of the quiet man who'd lived among them for 40 years. The harbor itself had transformed in subtle, beautiful ways. Tourists, who once breezed past Thomas without a glance, now paused at the memorial, reading the plaque that outlined his heroic service. Local fishermen, long pushed aside by flashy pleasure craft, found themselves greeted with newfound respect. Isn't it amazing how one moment can ripple through a community? The most surprising change was in the children. Once kept at arm's length from the old fishermen, they now flocked to the docks after school, their eyes wide with curiosity. They begged for stories and skills no app could teach. On this particular afternoon, Thomas sat on a sturdy new bench by his old mooring spot, showing a group of kids how to tie knots. His gnarled fingers danced with surprising grace, weaving rope into patterns that had held ships steady through countless storms. "This one's a bowline," he said, his voice as gentle as the sea breeze. "It's been saving sailors since before Columbus sailed. Can you believe that?" A 7-year-old girl, named Lily, watched intently, her small hands following his guide. Suddenly she blurted out, "Are you mad at the man who broke your boat?" Her innocent question hung in the air, and Thomas paused, giving it the same care he gave her. "Not. No," he said at last. "If not for them, maybe no one would have remembered that boat ever existed." The kids nodded solemnly, grasping a wisdom many adults overlooked. Don't you just love the clarity of a child's perspective? Later that day, an unexpected figure appeared at the dock's edge. Jackson Reed, his designer sunglasses pushed up, looking out of place without his usual entourage. "Mr. Reynolds," he stammered, then faltered, clearly uneasy in this humble setting. "I came to apologize. My behavior, it was inexcusable." Thomas nodded, waiting silently. Reed pulled out an envelope, his voice earnest. "I want to make this right. There's a blank check here. Name your price for the boat. For my actions. Anything." Thomas eyed the envelope, but didn't reach for it. "Money can't rebuild what's gone," he said softly. Reed's face fell, but he pressed on, a crack in his polished demeanor. "Then tell me what. I've been a total jerk. And now the internet's calling me the guy who wrecked a hero's boat. How do I fix this?" Can you feel the raw honesty in that plea? Thomas studied Reed for a long moment, then spoke. "There's a spot on the eastern pier, where the sunrise hits just right. Put a bench there. A solid one, built to last. Carve 3 words on it. Sit, remember, thank." Reed blinked, stunned. "That's it? Just a bench?" Thomas looked out at the water, his voice steady. "Sometimes what people need most is a place to pause and think about what mattered. Don't you agree?" 2 days later, a master woodworker from Seattle arrived, installing a hand-carved teak bench at the exact spot Thomas chose. The words "sit, remember, thank" gleamed in bronze, destined to age gracefully with the sea. Reed himself helped with the installation, his manicured hands blistering as he worked without complaint. Word of Thomas's request spread like wildfire, reaching national news. "Veteran declines fortune, requests memorial bench inst." Commentators debated, was he too forgiving or profoundly wise? Veterans groups hailed his choice as a testament to true service. Isn't it inspiring how one man's humility can spark such reflection? Thomas shunned the spotlight, sticking to his quiet routine, now focused on teaching rather than fishing. Without Liberty Child, he couldn't supply fish to the community kitchen as he had for decades, but he offered something just as precious: time, patience, and wisdom born of a life tied to the sea. A month later, Admiral Nelson returned, this time in civilian clothes, driving an unassuming car. He found Thomas at his usual dockside spot. "The Secretary of the Navy has an offer," Nelson said, grinning. "They're expanding a youth maritime program, seamanship, navigation, environmental stewardship. They need instructors who get the sea and kids. You're perfect." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "I'm an old man, Admiral, not much use anymore." Nelson laughed. "Tell that to the kids trailing you like ducklings. It's yours. Part-time, flexible, with a decent stipend. What do you say?" Before Thomas could answer, a commotion at the harbor entrance stole their attention. A small wooden boat glided in, its traditional design gleaming with fresh paint that read, "Liberty's Child." The whole town seemed to crowd the docks, and at the helm stood Michael, beaming. "Surprise, Grandpa," he shouted. "We all chipped in. I found your old plans in the shed. The Boat Builders Association donated materials, and veterans from 4 states helped build her." Thomas stood frozen, his weathered face trembling with emotion, as the boat so like his lost love neared the dock. "It's not identical," Michael admitted, tying the lines. "We added modern safety gear,
and updated navigation. But the soul, that's all yours, Grandpa. Your heart designed it. Can you imagine the joy in that reunion? Thomas stepped aboard, his feet finding balance on the rocking deck like they'd never left. He ran his hand along the polished rail, a new American flag snapping proudly at the... For a man who kept faith, Michael whispered, even when no one was watching. That evening, as the harbor glowed golden under the sunset, Thomas sat on Reed's bench, watching fishing boats return. A young couple paused nearby, reading the bench's inscription. Their child piped up. What does it mean? The father knelt down. It means we should stop sometimes and think about the people who made our lives possible. Like him, Thomas smiled faintly, his eyes on the horizon, where sea and sky merged in perfect blue. In a world rushing forward, Thomas became a living reminder to look back, not with nostalgia, but with respect for the foundations of today. His new Liberty's child would sail the same waters, carrying the same values: steadiness in storms, help freely given, quiet courage when needed. He didn't demand justice. He just picked up the torn flag and walked away. But the next morning, the sea remembered him. If you believe stories like this deserve to live on, subscribe to QH Incredible Stories, where honor is never forgotten and silence never wins. It's just an old fishing tub. Get over it. The yacht owner had laughed as his hull crushed a veteran's boat. No help came, no apologies offered. The flag on that sun-bleached vessel drifted, torn into the harbor. But the next morning, 6 Navy ships arrived in silence, their flags at half-mast. Who were they honoring? Why did the sea suddenly remember one forgotten man? Do you still believe good deeds come full circle? Share your thoughts.